All right, get ready because today we're doing a deep dive into mentorship. Well, mentorship with a twist.
A twist.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring the idea of being cruel to be kind in the workplace.
Ooh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that sometimes maybe a little tough love can be what someone needs to actually grow.
It's definitely a thought-provoking concept. It really challenges that kind of, traditional view of mentorship, right? Where it's all like sunshine and rainbows and.
Yeah,
But our source material really digs into this whole dynamic, especially, given the fast-paced, high-stakes world that is the modern corporate environment.
for sure. Like it's not your grandma's workplace anymore.
Right, exactly.
So to kick things off, I think it'd be good to unpack this idea of psychological safety, which our source material really emphasizes, right? Like
Yeah.
it says it's super crucial, like fundamental to any mentorship relationship.
Yeah.
But I think there's a bit of a head scratcher here. Because how do you pair psychological safety with cruel to be kind? Those seem kind of contradictory.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's really where the nuance comes in. What the source really clearly points out is that psychological safety, it doesn't mean shielding someone from reality.
Right.
It's not about, tiptoeing around tough conversations. Instead, it's about fostering an environment where they feel safe enough to receive that constructive criticism, knowing it's coming from a place of genuine support, not just someone trying to tear them down.
So it's like, I trust you enough to be able to hear the hard truths because I know you have my best interests at heart.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also why the source argues that this cruel to be kind mentorship, it actually works best when it's delivered with like a good dose of emotional intelligence.
Okay, I like that. So let's dig into that for a second. What does emotional intelligence actually look like in a mentor? Like, how does that play out in a real world scenario?
Well, picture this. You're mentoring someone and they're struggling with public speaking,
Yeah.
a pretty common fear, right?
For sure.
A mentor without a lot of emotional intelligence, they might just throw that person into a high pressure presentation like sink or swim.
Right, trial by fire.
Yeah, exactly. And that could be, well, pretty cruel, right? Even if you think it's for their own good.
Totally.
Instead, a more emotionally intelligent approach would be to maybe suggest they start practicing in smaller, lower stakes settings,
Right. Yeah,
like
yeah.
team meetings. That way they can build up their confidence, get comfy with the whole process before having to face that larger audience.
So it's really about meeting them where they are,
Oh.
recognizing their individual needs, their anxieties, and then tailoring your approach accordingly.
100%. And this actually leads into another point the source brings up. It's the importance of a mentor's demonstrated competence.
Okay, so you're saying it's not enough to just talk the talk.
No, not at all. Think about it. If you're being mentored by someone who like consistently fumbles presentations, misses deadlines, seems totally disorganized, how much weight are their words really going to carry?
Yeah, not much. It's kind of hard to take advice from someone who can't seem to get their own act together.
Right. But when your mentor is someone who you admire, who clearly knows their stuff and who navigates challenges with like grace and skill,
Yeah.
their feedback, their guidance, it just holds so much more weight.
Like their actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. And that's also why the source emphasizes that cruel to be kind can actually mean holding yourself as the mentor to a high standard.
Right.
You're demonstrating those very qualities you're trying to instill in your mentee.
Showing them the way. But I think with all this, there's definitely a fine line, right, between pushing someone and pushing them too far.
Yeah.
How do you, like, find that balance, that sweet spot?
That's where the source's emphasis on logic and objectivity comes into play. When you're delivering that tough love feedback, it's crucial to keep it focused on observable behaviors and their impact,
Okay.
not making it personal or emotionally charged.
So, for example, instead of saying your presentation was terrible.
Right, exactly. You might say something like, I noticed that you didn't make eye contact with the audience, and that might have made it harder for them to really connect with your message.
Okay, so it's about depersonalizing it,
Yeah.
making it more about the work itself.
Yes. And it's also about setting those firm boundaries.
Good.
But, and this is important, it's not about being authoritarian.
Right.
It's about being clear and consistent.
So it's like saying, these are the expectations, this is how we do things here, let's work together so we're all on the same page.
Precisely. And that actually brings us to another crucial aspect that I think is often overlooked when we talk about cruel to be kind mentorship: listening.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does listening fit into all of this?
Well, The source argues that even when you're giving tough feedback, it's so important to actually listen to your mentee, to really understand their perspective, their concerns. Think about it, how receptive are you to feedback, even if it's well-intentioned, if you feel like the other person isn't really listening?
Oh, yeah, it's like, what's the point if you're not even hearing me?
Exactly. But when someone truly listens, when they make you feel heard, you're much more likely to be open to what they have to say, even if it's challenging or even critical.
So listening, in a way, is a form of respect.
Yeah.
You're showing them that you value their thoughts, their feelings, even if you don't always agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It creates that foundation of trust that's so essential for this whole cruel to be kind mentorship to actually be effective.
Okay, so we've got psychological safety, we've got emotional intelligence, we've got that demonstrated competence, clear communication, firm boundaries, active listening. I feel like our source is really building like a solid framework for this approach.
Yeah.
But then it throws in this curveball. It starts talking about the importance of discipline and rigor.
Yeah.
I mean, those sound kind of intense,
Right.
especially when you put them together with this whole cruel to be kind thing.
For sure. And those are absolutely essential ingredients for success in pretty much any field. But the key here is balance. Our source cautions against pushing for perfectionism, like to an unhealthy degree.
Right. Because who can actually be perfect all the time?
Exactly. And it just sets people up for burnout and self-doubt.
And you can't create, from a place of fear and constant pressure.
Right. It's not about being flawless. It's about striving for excellence.
Yeah.
While recognizing that mistakes, they're inevitable, they're actually part of the learning process.
So you're encouraging high standards, but you're also fostering a healthy sense of resilience and self-compassion.
Yeah, exactly. And that ties into this concept of a growth mindset, which our source emphasizes is crucial for both mentors and mentees.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around a lot lately, but can you break down what it actually means in this context?
Sure, it's basically the belief that abilities and intelligence, they're not fixed. You can develop them through effort, through learning, persistence. It's about seeing challenges as opportunities, not threats.
Okay.
So instead of saying, I'm not good at this, you'd say, I'm not good at this.
Yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a subtle shift, but it makes a big difference.
And I imagine, too, it ties into the whole idea of setting practical goals, like breaking those big challenges down into smaller, more manageable steps,
Yeah,
and then celebrating those small victories, those little wins along the way.
absolutely. All of that is part of cultivating a growth mindset, both in yourself and in the person you're mentoring.
And that seems like an area where mentors can really, step up and provide guidance and support, right?
Yeah.
Like, as the mentee is going through those inevitable challenges, those setbacks.
Yeah, for sure. And this is especially important because, as our source points out, today's workplace, it's a whirlwind. It's fast-paced, competitive, constantly changing,
It's a lot.
right? So it's really a whole different ball game than when a lot of us started out.
So, given all of that, what does it say mentors should do? How should we approach this with mentees?
Well, the source actually argues that we shouldn't shield mentees from those challenges.
Oh, interesting.
Instead, we should expose them to them.
Okay.
Of course, with support and guidance.
Right, like not just throwing them to the wolves.
No. It's about giving them a taste of reality, but in a controlled environment where they can experiment, where
Yeah.
they can make mistakes and learn from those experiences.
So equipping them with the tools and the confidence they need to face whatever comes their way.
Exactly. But of course, there's a flip side to this whole mentorship thing, and it's something our source doesn't shy away from. What happens when the mentee isn't putting in the effort? Or, even worse, isn't competent?
Oh, yeah, it's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And it's tempting to avoid those conversations, right?
Right.
Because they're just uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But our source is pretty clear. Ignoring the problem won't make it magically disappear. In fact, it's actually unkind in the long run.
Okay.
Because you're allowing that mentee to continue down a path that might not be right for them. And it can also damage the team, the whole organization.
So cruel to be kind in this context means having those tough conversations,
Yes, exactly. Having the courage to address those issues directly,
even when it's uncomfortable.
even when it's super uncomfortable. But, thankfully, our source gives us some helpful strategies for how to approach those conversations constructively. So first of all, it emphasizes the importance of actually exploring the underlying causes of that mentee's, underperformance.
Right.
So don't just assume right off the bat that they're lazy or incompetent.
Right.
There might be something else going on that's preventing them from succeeding. Maybe they're simply in the wrong role, or they lack like some really key foundational knowledge or skills, or maybe they're dealing with personal issues that are affecting their work.
So you're saying the first step is to try to understand, like, what's really going on.
Exactly. Get to the root of the problem.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
But even if you figure out the underlying cause, you still got to address those performance issues themselves.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But how you go about it is crucial. The source recommends sticking to specific behaviors and their impact
Okay.
rather than making, like sweeping judgments about the person's character.
Wow.
So instead of saying you're always late, you might say, when you're late for these meetings, it throws everyone off.
Yeah.
It makes people feel like their time isn't valued.
Okay, so you're being descriptive, objective, you're giving concrete examples, and then explaining why those behaviors actually matter in a professional context.
Exactly. And it helps them to see the connection between their actions and the consequences, which can be a really powerful motivator for change.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about uncovering those root causes of underperformance and delivering that feedback in a constructive way.
Right.
What else does our source suggest for handling these kind of tough situations?
Well, it also really emphasizes the importance of being crystal clear about those expectations and the
Yeah.
consequences. So it's like, here's what I need from you, and here's what will happen if those expectations aren't met.
Yeah. And that can be like a really tough conversation to have, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it might mean having to let someone go if they're not able to meet those expectations or improve.
Right.
But sometimes that can be the kindest thing in the long run,
Yeah.
both for them and for the team.
Absolutely. And it's also about recognizing when a mentorship just isn't working.
Yeah.
Knowing when to redirect your energy, to someone who's more receptive and more motivated.
As someone who wants to be there.
Right.
And speaking of receptiveness, our source has a whole section about mentoring the modern graduate, which is, let's face it, a whole different animal than it used to be.
Oh, for sure. Today's graduates, they're entering a world that's vastly different from the one that many of us stepped into when we were starting out. It's rapidly changing, it's driven by technology, and it's becoming more and more diverse.
So what kind of advice does our source give for mentors who are kind of navigating this new world? What do they need to be doing differently?
Well, first and foremost, embracing technology.
Yeah, makes sense.
Digital tools are just like essential now for communication, project management, learning, networking.
Gone are the days of just face-to-face meetings and file cabinets full of paper.
Yeah, exactly. So mentors need to be comfy using these tools themselves, and they need to be able to guide their mentees in doing the same.
So tech proficiency is like a must-have. What else?
It also highlights promoting inclusivity.
Okay.
Today's workplace, it thrives on diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds. So mentors, we need to create environments where everyone feels valued, respected.
It's not just about, like, tolerance. It's about actively fostering a sense of belonging.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about recognizing the unique challenges that different groups face.
Right, because not everyone's experience is the same.
Not at all. And mentors, they might need to be more aware of things like unconscious bias or microaggressions and be prepared to address those issues head on.
Okay, so embracing technology, promoting inclusivity, what else?
The source also really emphasizes encouraging lifelong learning. The skills that are in demand today, they might be obsolete tomorrow, right? So we need to instill in those we mentor that learning's a continuous process. It's not a one and done thing.
It's about always evolving, always growing.
Exactly. And finally, it emphasizes the importance of modeling work-life balance. It's not about, glorifying burnout. It's about showing that it's possible to be successful and have a life outside of work.
Which is such a crucial message for people just starting out. Like,
Yeah.
hey, you can achieve your goals and have time for the things you enjoy. You don't have to sacrifice everything for success.
Exactly. And that means setting those healthy boundaries, prioritizing self-care, showing them it's okay to disconnect, to recharge.
To have a life.
Right.
Well, this has been like jam-packed with insights. We've gone from those foundational principles of cruel to be kind mentorship all the way to some really practical strategies for handling those tricky situations that, let's be honest, we all encounter at some point.
Yeah, it's been quite a deep dive.
It has. So, dear listener, as we kind of wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I'm really curious. What are your initial thoughts? What's resonating with you the most so far?
Welcome back to our deep dive on Cruel to be Kind mentorship.
As we've been exploring, it's not about like being mean or anything.
Right.
It's about having those tough conversations, providing that honest feedback, even when it's hard to hear, but in a way that ultimately helps someone grow.
Exactly. And so, in this part of the deep dive, I think it would be useful to shift gears a little bit. We're going to focus more on that practical side of things. Like, how can mentors actually put these principles into action? What are some concrete strategies?
Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about emotional intelligence and a growth mindset in theory, but then how do you actually embody those things when you're interacting with someone, as their mentor?
Yeah, exactly. So, let's start with something that we already touched on a little bit: clear communication. Mentors really need to be able to articulate their expectations, provide that constructive feedback, and set boundaries. But it's got to be done in a supportive, respectful way.
Right, so it's kind of a tightrope walk, isn't it? You got to be firm, but not like a dictator.
Mhm.
Honest, but not hurtful.
Exactly. And that's where emotional intelligence really comes into play. A mentor with, strong EI, they can kind of read the room, so to speak, and tailor their communication style to that mentee's personality
Yeah.
and emotional state.
So you're saying it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing?
No, not at all. Some mentees might thrive on that direct, no-nonsense feedback,
Yeah.
while others might need something more gentle, more encouraging. It's about finding what works for each person.
Okay, so communication is key. What else should mentors focus on if they're really trying to put this cruel to be kind approach into practice?
Well, another crucial thing is setting clear goals and expectations. And this is where that whole planning element that we discussed earlier really comes into play. A good mentor should work with their mentee to establish very specific goals.
Okay.
Goals that are measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. What we call SMART goals.
SMART goals. I love a good acronym.
Right.
But wait, I think it's worth pausing here for a sec, because not everyone listening might know that term off the top of their head.
Yeah.
Can you break down what a SMART goal actually is and why they matter in mentorship?
Absolutely. So each letter in that acronym, SMART, stands for a specific characteristic of a well-defined goal. So S, specific.
Yeah.
The goal should be very clear, very well-defined. M is for measurable, meaning there should be a way to actually track your progress and determine if you've hit that goal. A is achievable, so the goal should be realistic, something they can actually do. R is for relevant. It should align with their overall career aspirations and the whole point of the mentorship itself. And finally, T is for time-bound. There should be a deadline or at least a time frame associated with it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So instead of just saying, like, I want to get better at communicating,
Right.
a SMART goal would be more like, I want to be able to deliver a 10-minute presentation to my team and do it confidently. And that's got to be done by the end of this quarter.
Exactly. That's way more clear, more actionable, and it gives both you as the mentor and your mentee a very specific target.
And I imagine, too, that it just makes it easier to provide feedback.
Yeah.
You can track that progress. You can pinpoint those areas where they might be struggling.
Right.
And then you can adjust your approach as needed.
Yep. Setting those SMART goals, it basically gives you both a roadmap. It creates that shared understanding. What does success look like?
Yeah.
And how do we get there?
So you're not just like wandering through this mentorship, hoping for the best. You've got an actual destination.
Right, exactly. And this also ties into another aspect that we've touched on before, which is providing feedback regularly. A good mentor shouldn't wait till the very end to give feedback.
Okay.
It should be a continuous process.
Yeah. Ongoing, integrated into those regular check-ins, right?
Exactly. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the elephant in the room here. Feedback, especially when it's not all positive and rosy, it can be a bit tricky. It's often the part that people dread the most, both the giver and the receiver. So how can mentors deliver constructive criticism without, just demoralizing the person? How do you make that cruel part feel kind?
Right, because you don't want to just like crush their spirit.
No, not at all. And thankfully, our source gives us some really practical tips. So first, as we've talked about before, focus on those very specific behaviors and their impact, not on making judgments about their character.
Okay.
Instead of saying, you're always late, you try saying something like, when you arrive late for those meetings, it disrupts the flow and it makes others feel like, their time isn't valued.
So you're being descriptive, objective, rather than saying, you're such a disorganized person.
Right, exactly. You're focusing on the observable behavior and the consequences.
Yeah.
You're not attacking their character. Second, try to frame feedback as an opportunity for growth. So instead of saying you need to improve your presentation skills,
Right.
you might say, I've noticed that your presentations could be even more engaging if you incorporated more visuals or maybe some storytelling techniques. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, yeah. So you're turning it into a challenge.
Yeah.
Something they can actively work on, not just pointing out a flaw. It's like you're saying, hey, I see potential in you, and I want to help you reach it.
Exactly. And finally, be sure to balance that less than positive feedback with some positive reinforcement. You want to highlight their strengths, celebrate those accomplishments, and acknowledge their effort, even when they stumble.
Everyone needs that little pat on the back.
For sure. It's like saying, hey, I see you're trying, and I appreciate your effort, even if it's not perfect yet.
Exactly. And remember, feedback goes both ways.
Right.
Mentors should also be open to hearing what their mentees have to say, to feedback from them.
Yeah, that's super important.
It creates that culture of respect and open communication.
Absolutely. It's a two-way street. It should be a dialogue, not a one-sided lecture from the mentor.
The mentee should feel comfortable sharing their perspective, even if they don't agree.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we've covered communication, goal setting, and feedback. All super crucial parts of effective mentorship. But what about that whole idea of really challenging those you mentor to step outside their comfort zone? That's where that whole cruel to be kind element can really come in, right?
Right, because sometimes you got to kind of push someone to get them to that next level.
Absolutely. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to push them beyond what they think they're capable of. But how you go about it really matters.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Because there's a way to do it where it's motivating,
Yeah.
empowering, and then there's a way to do it that just makes someone feel overwhelmed and defeated. Like, what's the point?
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
Yeah.
So how can mentors challenge their mentees in a way that's both effective and supportive? Well, our source offers some suggestions.
Sally, I'm on me.
One way is to delegate those more challenging tasks, ones that actually stretch their skills, push them to think differently. This might be like a project that requires them to take on more responsibility, maybe learn a totally new skill, or work with a team they've never collaborated with before.
So it's about giving them a chance to really prove themselves, to see what they can do when they're given a bit more autonomy, more responsibility. But it's also about being there to support them, right? Giving them the resources to succeed. You're not just like throwing them into the deep end and saying, good luck.
Right. It's like that trust fall exercise. You got to be there to catch them. But you're also encouraging them to take that leap.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And I think, too, that mentors can play a huge role in helping mentees to reframe their mindset around failure. Because let's face it, failure is going to happen, especially when you're trying new things, putting yourself out there. But how you view those failures, I think, really makes all the difference.
100%. Mentors, we can help them to see those failures as learning experiences, not as signs of weakness or a reason to give up.
So instead of getting discouraged, they're asking themselves, okay, what did I learn here? How can I do things differently next time? What can I take away from this?
Yes. It's all about fostering that growth mindset we were talking about, where those setbacks, they're just stepping stones, not roadblocks.
Okay, so we've talked about communication, goal setting, feedback, challenging our mentees, all super important stuff when it comes to cruel to be kind mentorship.
Yeah.
Anything else that mentors should keep in mind as they navigate this approach?
Well, it's important to remember that mentorship is a relationship at its core.
Yeah.
And like any relationship, it takes effort, commitment from both sides.
Yeah, it's a two-way street.
A partnership. Mentors should be reliable, responsive, genuinely invested. They need to make time for regular meetings, offer helpful feedback, be available.
So it's not just like checking a box in your to-do list.
No.
It's about being present, you know?
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of the mentee's time, their boundaries. You don't want to be overbearing. You're there to guide and support, not micromanage or control.
Okay, respecting each other's space.
Yeah. And speaking of boundaries, it's also crucial for mentors to establish those boundaries for themselves.
What do you mean?
Well, you're not their therapist, you know? You're
Well-
not their best friend, their personal assistant. It's a professional relationship.
Right.
So you have to define the scope of the mentorship, be upfront about what you're willing to do and what you're not, and be honest about your own limitations. If they're struggling with something and it's just not your area of expertise, it's okay to say, hey, I'm not the right person for this, but I can help you find someone who is.
I'll help you connect with someone.
Exactly. And finally, mentors, we got to be willing to adapt. Because the mentees' needs are going to evolve. Their goals are going to change over time. What works at the beginning might not work a year down the road.
Yeah.
They're going to develop new skills, gain more confidence, face different challenges.
It's a constant process.
It is. Mentorship, it's a journey, not a destination. And it should be a continuous process of learning, growth, and support.
I feel like we've really started to unpack the more practical side of this cruel to be kind mentorship.
Yeah.
We've talked about communication, goal setting, feedback, challenging our mentees, and those healthy boundaries.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
it is. But remember, effective mentorship, it's a skill. You develop it over time. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become. And the rewards, both for you and the person you're mentoring, they make it worth it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the principles and the practices of cruel to be kind mentorship.
Yeah.
But I can't help but think about all the what ifs,
Oh.
the things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
What are those tricky situations when things don't go according to plan?
Yeah.
What about those?
Yes. The inevitable bumps in the road. The stuff that keeps you up at night.
Yes.
That's what we're going to tackle in the last part of our deep dive.
Okay. I am on the edge of my seat. Okay, we're back. For the final part of our deep dive into cruel to be kind mentorship.
Yeah.
And as promised, we're going to tackle those kind of tricky situations that mentors often face, the moments that really put this whole approach to the test.
These are the ones that can keep you up at night.
Right.
Make you question everything. Like, am I doing more harm than good here?
Exactly. So let's jump right in. One of the most, I think, common challenges that mentors run into, and one that our source material really spends some time on, is the unengaged mentee.
Oh, yeah.
The one who just doesn't seem to be taking it seriously, misses meetings, doesn't do the work, just kind of lacks initiative.
It's like you're pushing a boulder uphill. You're putting in all this effort, and it's just, like, bouncing right off them.
It's so frustrating. It's like you're offering them this, gift, this opportunity,
Yeah.
and they're just not interested.
It can be really disheartening. And it's easy to get to that point where you're just like, well, if they don't care, why should I?
Yeah, right. It's tempting to just throw in the towel, be like, fine, whatever, do what you want. I'm not going to waste my energy on someone who isn't willing to put in the effort.
Yeah, but our source actually cautions against giving up so quickly. It says it's really important to try to understand why. What's the root of that disengagement before you just walk away?
So you're saying don't jump to conclusions.
Right.
Don't just assume they're lazy or that they don't care. Maybe there's something else going on that's preventing them from really participating, from engaging.
Exactly. Maybe they're feeling overwhelmed. They've got a ton of other stuff on their plate. Maybe they're dealing with personal things and it's spilling over into their work. Maybe they just don't feel equipped, like they don't have the right skills or knowledge to succeed. Or maybe it's as simple as they're not even sure what they want to get out of the mentorship.
So before you write them off, have a conversation. Try to understand where they're coming from.
Yes. And an honest conversation, too.
Okay, but how do you even approach that? It's got to be kind of tricky, right? Calling someone out on their lack of effort without making them defensive or just shutting down completely.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a delicate balance. But our source has some good advice. It suggests focusing on what you're actually observing and expressing those concerns in a way that's not judgmental.
Okay.
So instead of saying, you're not taking this mentorship seriously, you might say something like, hey, I've noticed you've missed the last couple of meetings. I'm wondering if there's something going on that's preventing you from fully participating.
So you're not accusing them. You're just expressing concern and then opening up that space for a real conversation.
Exactly.
And then you listen.
Yes.
Really listen to what they have to say without interrupting, without jumping to conclusions.
Active listening is super important here. You want to make it safe for them to share what's going on, even if it's not what you expect or what you want to hear.
Because maybe there's a good reason. And once you understand that, you can work together to find a solution.
Exactly. Maybe they need a more flexible schedule. Maybe they need more support, more resources. Maybe they need more clarity on what the goals are, what's expected of them. Once you get to the root of it, you can start addressing it in a constructive way.
Okay. What if there isn't a good reason, though? What if they're just not putting in the effort? What if they just, I don't know, aren't motivated to grow?
Well, then you might have to be a bit more direct. But still, do it with empathy and respect.
So it's not about attacking them or, making them feel bad. It's about being honest and setting boundaries.
Exactly. You might say something like, listen, I'm here to support you. I really want to see you succeed. But I also need to see that same level of commitment from you. If you're not able to prioritize this mentorship right now, that's totally okay. But we need to be honest about it.
So you're giving them that chance to step up, but you're also like drawing that line in the sand.
Yeah.
You're not going to keep pouring your energy into something if they're not meeting you halfway.
Exactly. And honestly, sometimes that is the kindest thing. Walking away can actually be beneficial for both of you. It frees you up to find someone who's more receptive. And it frees them up to, maybe focus on other things or find a mentor who's a better fit.
It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water.
But you can't make it drink.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best thing you can do is step back.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the unengaged mentee. What about some of the other tricky situations? Our source also talks about personality clashes, right?
Yeah.
How those can really derail a mentorship.
Oh, yeah. The clash of personalities, it
Yeah.
happens. It can make the whole thing feel like you're walking on eggshells.
I bet. It's
Yeah.
like you're trying to have these like open and honest conversations, but you keep butting heads, you're speaking different languages.
It can be so frustrating, and it's easy to let those personal differences overshadow the bigger picture, the whole point of the mentorship.
Right.
But what our source really stresses is that you don't have to be best friends with your mentee,
Right.
to have a successful mentorship.
You can have different personalities and still work well together.
Exactly. And sometimes it helps to just acknowledge those differences up front, Like, hey, I've noticed that we have different communication styles, but I'm committed to making this work. How can we best communicate so we're both getting what we need?
So you're addressing the elephant in the room,
Right.
but you're framing it as a problem to solve together,
Yeah,
not a reason to just give up.
exactly. And a lot of times, simply acknowledging it can really help to reduce that tension and create a more productive dynamic.
It's like you're saying, I see you, I get that we're different, but I'm still here for you.
Yeah, and it opens the door for creative problem solving. How can we bridge those differences? How can we make this work?
Okay, so communication, yet again, is key.
Yeah.
What about when the mentee just isn't receptive to feedback? Like they get defensive and they just shut down? When you try to offer constructive criticism, even when you're coming from that cruel to be kind place.
That's a tough one. It's where that balance, that dance between cruel and kind gets really tricky.
Yeah, because you don't want to sugarcoat things or avoid giving them that feedback that they really need to grow. But you also don't want to, completely discourage them, make them feel like a failure.
Exactly. So how do you strike that balance? Well, our source suggests a few things. First, make sure, like we've talked about before, that you're delivering that feedback in a way that's constructive, focused on those specific behaviors, not attacks on their character.
So not you're doing this wrong,
Yeah.
but more when you do this, it has this impact. And here's how we can do it better.
Right. And it's important to create that space for them to share their perspective, too. Ask questions like, how are you feeling about this feedback? What do you think about trying a different approach?
Okay, so you're letting them process it, make them feel heard.
Exactly. And sometimes it can even be helpful to share your own experiences, like times when you've received tough feedback. How did you deal with it?
Yeah, I like that.
It shows them you're not immune to it.
It humanizes you,
Mhm.
makes them feel less alone in their struggle.
Exactly. But let's be real, sometimes no matter what you do, they might just not be ready to hear it.
Yeah.
And in those cases, it's okay to acknowledge that and maybe even take a step back from the mentorship for a bit.
Give them space.
Right. Like, I'm here for you when you're ready, but I'm not going to force it. And sometimes that time and space apart, it can actually be beneficial. They can process things, come to terms with it, and maybe even come back to the mentorship with a more open mind.
Okay, so we've talked about the unengaged mentee, we've talked about personality clashes, and what to do when someone's just not receptive to feedback.
Yeah.
Anything else? Any other tricky situations that our source highlights?
Well, one more that I think is really important for mentors to remember is taking care of themselves.
Ah, yes, the often forgotten part of the equation.
Right.
It's easy to get so caught up in helping someone else that you neglect your own needs.
It happens all the time. Mentors are so giving, they can burn themselves out.
Yeah, it's like that oxygen mask analogy, right? You got to put on your own mask first before you can help anyone else.
Exactly. You can't pour from an empty cup.
So what are some tips for avoiding burnout?
Well-
Taking care of yourself as a mentor.
Well, first and foremost, set those clear boundaries around your time and your availability. Let your mentee know when you're free to meet, what you're willing to help them with, And don't be afraid to say no if they're asking for too much. It's also important to have a life outside of mentorship, you know? Don't let it consume you. Make time for your own interests, your family, your friends. Take care of yourself, both physically and mentally.
Yeah, right. Get some sleep.
Yes. And don't be afraid to ask for help yourself. If you're feeling overwhelmed or burned out, talk to someone. Reach out to your own mentor or a therapist
Mm.
or even just a trusted colleague. There's no shame in asking for support.
Wow. This whole deep dive, this has been quite a journey. We've covered so much, from the foundational principles of cruel to be kind mentorship, all the way to those practical strategies and those tricky situations. It's been eye-opening.
It has. And I think the key takeaway here is that cruel to be kind mentorship. It's not about being harsh or uncaring. It's about caring enough to challenge them, to push them, to help them to become the best versions of themselves.
And to do it all with empathy, respect, and a genuine desire to see them succeed.
Exactly.
It's about that balance, that dance between support and challenge, kindness and honesty.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, dear listener, we encourage you to think about your own experiences with mentorship. Have you been a mentor? A mentee? What are you taking away from all of this? How can you apply these insights?
And remember, being a good mentor, it's a skill. It takes practice, patience, and a willingness to learn and grow yourself. But trust me, the rewards, they're immeasurable for both of you.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building those meaningful connections.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy mentoring.